Sublation Media was founded and it was getting some help from Chris Catrone to get rolling, there was ambivalence within Platypus about the project. I'm just curious to know what the source.
Wow.
I mean, I know what.
You put me on the spot now, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure I framed it as gossip.
I framed it.
I think it's fair. I think that's fair to say.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
All right. Well, welcome to the Diet Soap Podcast. I'm Douglas Lane, the longtime host of Diet Soap. With me today is Stanley Sharpey. He is the author of The Discreet Charm of the PMC, a controversial, if not widely read article yet. Catherine Liu was unhappy with you, Stanley. And that's,
I know.
Yeah, on Twitter. I don't remember exactly what she said, and she actually deleted the tweet, but she did not like the Marxists coming in to question the category of the PMC. But the article is called The Discreet Charm of the PMC. And Stanley Sharpey is a socialist living in London. He is a Platt. Stanley, let's jump in here regarding your article. How did you come to write this? And are you yourself a member of the PMC?
Wow. Okay. Yeah. I should have anticipated that opening question. I think probably by most people's measure. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I'm skeptical that that's a particularly useful or coherent category. Although I will say that in the course of writing this article, I think I came out more sympathetic to the Ehrenreichs than I had initially expected. But yeah, so at the moment I work in administration in the university, so that's pretty much I'd say that's pretty archetypal PMC occupation. I mean, it's I haven't done that for very long, but and prior to that I worked in like social care with people with learning disabilities, which I think was also sort of weirdly a motivating factor behind trying to think about this, partly because, I think what's interesting about the concept of the PMC in its original formulation is that those so-called caring professions and even like professional healthcare is also included, right? And I think maybe that falls out of the discussion today. I mean, because there are these sometimes it's talked about as if the laptop class is synonymous with the PMC. But really where they were getting this idea from, or where they had the germ of this idea, was in, I'm talking about the Ehrenreichs here, Barbara and John Ehrenreich, was in their studies of medicine and the development of professionalized medicine in the US specifically. Which is probably not the first place people would go when thinking about the PMC today. That might be because of changes in that occupation, but also I think that sort of gets at part of what I was saying about how even though the concept is invoked today, it's not necessarily in the way that the Ehrenreichs would have recognized in the 70s.
When we talk about class today, the conversation is already confused often enough, I think. So for me, coming to have a Marxist conception of class meant that I tried to shelve some maybe cultural signifiers that would attach to the working class and the capitalist class or the bourgeoisie. Also, there are terms like the middle class, which aren't Marxist particularly, but that people think of. And I think that it's in the context of confusion about class that the PMC idea comes up. The for me, one of the confusions, I think, even as I became a Marxist, was about understanding what the proletariat was, because as I read more and tried to understand more, and as certainly after I started talking to Chris Catrone, the idea of the proletariat, but even before that, the idea that the proletariat was not merely workers. It was not just a description of a person's role in production and whether they had to work for a wage or not, but rather also had to do with their political aims.
Right.
And that adds a bit of confusion, because you can say proletariat and you can mean the people who are working in a chip manufacturing company in Taiwan, or you can mean members of the Labor Party. So the PMC category can be criticized as not being about class, but it might be a political category without also having a political economic or just an economic designation.
Right. So, yeah, I think with the PMC as a political category, I think that's actually one of the things that I wanted to take issue with in the original formulation, right? And this is also why I went back to Lukács, right? I mean, maybe it was a bit of a leap, but I think for me, I mean, obviously it's already there in Marx and other Marxists, but I think Lukács is sort of very explicit about formulating this, idiosyncratic Marxist notion of class, right? Which I say in the piece is not really a theory of class, or in the sense of like, here's how you identify a class, in your empirical data, right? Like an ideal type. He's more talking about like the Marxist philosophy of history and the importance of like class for that. So in terms of, the PMC as a class, the question then is like not just that they might, temporarily, well, already saying they is presuming that they have a unity, which maybe they don't, but that there is some common political interest, right? That they might unify in certain circumstances, but is that of the same kind as like what Lukács is talking about when he's talking about, the proletarian standpoint, right? That they have a view from which you could conceive of organizing society as a whole, right? And I think the Ehrenreichs are actually quite clear in their article that the PMC can't really do that. They can't become the ruling class. And this is one of the ways in which they want to distinguish themselves from someone like James Burnham and the idea of the managerial revolution. Because Burnham already, 30 years previously is saying that the managers are the new ruling class. So I think, they have this picture of the PMC as always condemned to be kind of torn between the capitalist proper and the working class proper. And they can never quite, they might advocate for their sort of, there is this category of PMC radicalism, which I talk about a bit, which is kind of, they equate with a kind of technocratic worldview. I'm just not sure that they are a class in the political sense.
Your camera turned off there for a second.
Okay, I'm back.
Okay.
Because
I mean, let's step back and clarify a little bit here. So PMC stands for the professional managerial class, and often enough, like over the last decade, let's say since Hillary Clinton lost, the notion of the professional managerial class being dominant in our society, there was this idea that they dominated are not only our politics, but also the culture, the media, the framing for our politics and for our general understanding. They were the ones that were responsible for wokeness,
Right.
for inventing it and also for perpetuating it. And they were the ones that needed to be purged, I think, from the Democratic Party. There needed to be a purging of the PMC, and the Social Democrats would, or the Democratic Socialists would be the ones to purge the PMC.
Right. Or just the labor-oriented wing of the Democrats, even, which I think was unfortunately conflated with social democracy. Right.
Right. It was conflated. Well, it was all, if you wanted to put it in one or two words, you would just say Bernie Sanders.
Right.
But you could also say the DSA. You might say Jacobin, which was a publication that was associated with all of this. And so, yeah, the NLRB would purge the PMC, I guess, first from their own ranks and then from the party. I'm not sure. But that's the political context for this question of the PMC, right? So was there a similar context to this when the term was coined? Was that what was basically going on? Was there a kind of is this an attempt to clean house from the beginning?
Right. So I think I can speak more to, I think it was an attempt to clean house in some way, but within the left, right? The left proper and the sort of remnants of the new left. I think that's the immediate context. So like, the original articles, there's two, and the first is just a kind of general discussion and definition of the PMC, and the second is specifically on the new left and the professional managerial class, right? So the whole formulation of the term professional managerial class is shaped by an attempt to reckon with the earlier new left from the standpoint of the 1970s. So, I mean, for Barbara and John Ehrenreich, it seems like for them, the new left is pretty much the student movement and student politics. Right, and they're trying to find some kind of reason for why this didn't work out, and they couldn't. They're still seeing these conflicts between educated radicals and sort of blue collar working class people. I mean, this is kind of a feature of the landscape of the 1970s in the US. Like, have the hard hat riots and things like that, where like workers are obviously pro-Vietnam, and they're literally fighting with students. So they're
pro the war in Vietnam, you mean?
Yes, sorry, pro the war in Vietnam. I'm sure some of them were pro Vietnamese, but I mean, depends which Vietnamese. So I mean, one of the questions I try to take up is like, are they trying to sort of purge the continuity new left of anyone who like has the stink of the PMC on them and create a pure working class left? And I kind of thought that's what they might be saying when I went into thinking about this, and I sort of was pleasantly surprised to find that that's not quite what they're saying. Like, they have a conception of the PMC turning against itself, which they already see in the late new left, so kind of the late 60s left, that people organically came up against the limits of their own, parochial worldview, and they tried, like, once they'd graduated, because they are talking about student politics, they went into the professions and they tried to kind of change the way those were done. So one of the examples they give is, doctors turning over control of treatment to the patients, which, I mean, obviously we can be skeptical about how useful that might be. But the idea is to like challenge this relationship between the patient and the expert, and the very idea of expertise, and try and give some kind of autonomy back to the patient.
That idea has taken hold, though, in the medical profession. It's still
right, patient-centered.
Patient-centered care, and the way I think the reason why is because it is a terrific way to protect yourself against litigation.
Right. They chose to do it, so it's not on me.
I asked them what they wanted me to do, and they told me. I told them what the different options were.
Right.
You know?
Right. I mean, I don't mean to say that like everything with the New Left that could have gone somewhere, it's inevitably not gone where it could have gone, and it's gone badly, right? And it's somehow been integrated into like the status quo, which was neoliberalism, and is
who knows what it is now.
Yeah. Who knows? And who knows if those elements that were preserved or like taken up from the New Left will continue. Maybe they'll change.
So I have a question, which is I hate it when this happens, when my brain decides to just evaporate a question. But no, the question has to do with what constituted success, so that in the 70s they could know that the New Left in the student movement had gone badly. What was the primary event or events that they had a particular outcome in mind that they didn't achieve?
Yeah, I think that's a little bit unclear to me. I mean, I think one of the criteria is being able to reach the working class, whatever that means. So I think they're sort of ambivalent, because they think, okay, clearly the late 60s was a high point of the student movement and we were in the doldrums in some way, but actually what they were seeing in the 70s, and I mean, this is kind of borne out, is that actually you are getting a more like blue collar participation in the left, and right, specifically in the form of new sectarian groups, right? Mm-hmm. So they kind of see like, I mean, it's easy for us to look back and think like, oh, the late 60s was like the crisis of the New Left, and then from there it's just all been it's kind of all been downhill. Not all been downhill, but like that was the peak for them anyway. Whereas I think there was a hope in the 70s that actually there'd be this defeat, and then lessons would be learned and they could rally, right? And actually now we're going to make this connection with the working class, whether that's through, okay, we're going to take up this like more rigid doctrinaire form of Marxism-Leninism, which is going to center the working class, or we're going to do a kind of turn to labor. We're going to proletarianize, or just do a rank and file strategy of some sort. There is this kind of militant turn to the working class in the 70s, which I think...
And that rank and file strategy was that leftists would go and join the rank and file and agitate within the working class directly as workers in factories and things like that, just to be clear what that was.
Yeah. So I think that's one of their criteria for success and failure, is they didn't sort of broaden their base beyond, the narrow horizons of student politics. And I mean, obviously the students were very well aware of this. Right? It's like one of the things that causes SDS to implode is the debates. I mean, they take on like ideological forms, in the sense that they look like debates over like the question of national self-determination, blah, blah, blah. But it's also a question of strategy, right? They're coming up against the limits of what can be done as a purely campus movement. And I think it's also important to remember that like the New Left goes right back to the 50s, at least to like the Khrushchev 4 and like Hungary in 1956. People are becoming disillusioned with official communism. So I mean, the New Left hadn't always been an exclusively student movement, right? Like even where it was a student movement in the early 60s, you had the Freedom Riders, right? People going down to the South. There was this horizon of building a multiracial coalition of, I can't remember what it's called, multiracial movement of the poor. That's it. I think that gets picked up by later sort of DSA stuff. So, this wasn't something that the protagonists of the New Left proper were unaware of. But yeah, I think the Ehrenreichs think they were necessarily limited because of where they were coming from, as it were. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And so the PMC thesis then was an explanation for why students were unable to make gains within the working class, even when they tried something like the rank and file strategy. And so, but now let's step back again and just say again, what is this professional managerial class?
Okay.
According to
Ehrenreich.
Yeah.
I might not be able to reproduce the definition word for word off the top of my head, but so the idea is that it's a kind of intermediary class between the capitalists, like the owners of capital, and the proletarianized working class. So the way that Ehrenreichs define it is by its function in the reproduction of capitalist social relations and ideology. I think that's pretty much verbatim what they say, but they see it as having come into being gradually from about the end of the 19th century to the period in which they're writing, the 1970s, and they think it's kind of hit its it kind of flowers in the 50s and 60s, and that's partly why you even have a New Left, which is a student movement. I mean, with that, they sort of mirror some other like more mainstream sociological accounts of the New Left, right? That it is just this kind of phenomenon that comes out of the overproduction of educated young people who are then chafing against they can't find adequate employment or like a place to have the lives they were sold, right? I mean, I think this is an interpretation that has also been applied to the millennial left, right, in terms of like downwardly mobile PMC.
Yeah. I just had a debate, mostly privately, with Benjamin Studebaker on this particular issue, where he was saying one of the things that really distinguishes the millennials from previous generations, for instance, Gen X, it was one of those kinds of debates. I was saying, you millennials think you had it so bad, but I look at the data and the Gen Xers didn't have any more wealth really than you guys did at the same age. We were also looking back at the boomers and saying we're never going to have the life that they did, just like you did too. Gen Xers and millennials are kind of like siblings in a way. Often Gen Xers will have boomer parents or nearly boomer parents, and the younger brother 10 years later with the second wife comes along, the millennial. But anyhow, I was debating this with Studebaker, and he said, well, the big difference is the number of educated young people that came out of the millennials, because it's a larger population and the greater rates of participation in university life, and the fact that there weren't jobs available for these young millennials after. And I immediately thought of May in '68 and thought, the reason the worker student protest rose was because of the Americanization of the French university system through institutions like the University of Nanterre, which was designed and thought of as a place to educate workers to help them be prepared to enter a more technological and hyper-managed industrial system. and the workers getting this education, sometimes from radicals like Henri Lefebvre taught at Nanterre, would feel as though they didn't have real opportunities. They were going to return to the factory just like their dads, that their dads had worked in at the end of this, and all they were doing is being put in a holding pen for a while and being educated in ways that weren't going to actually liberate them. Studebaker's response was, but that's not how it was in most of the world. In most of the world, the young people were rejecting the conformity of the previous life, even though they were going to be integrated into it.
Right.
And like at University of Berkeley, for instance, that was in the free speech movement and the movements that came out of that. There was a rejection of the conformity of the welfare state society. More
I guess this might get at what the whole question of PMC radicalism that the Ehrenreichs talk about, and like what is the content of that? Because I mean, yeah, if you want to say like they were protesting against their integration, it's like, well, what exactly would that have been a protest against, right? So I think on the Ehrenreichs account, professionals have this idea that they are driven by a professional ethic, right? Like they want to serve. They think that the career they want to go into should be held to like standards independent of anything else. That ultimately these professions are for the good of society, right? But what I mean, this comes up in something like the Port Huron statement. That they see like, okay, I could probably get a job, but like I'm not going to be able to realize these ideals in doing so, right? Because there's this presentiment of, oh wait, the professions aren't quite as secure as we thought in terms of their autonomy, and so I think the Ehrenreichs see like whenever the PMC kind of like forms itself into a class supposedly, or like advocates for its own interests, it's kind of a defense of the autonomy of the professions per se, and so like the very idea of expertise against like the rule of they would sort of say the rule of the market, right? That like, okay, I want to be a journalist and have journalistic ethics and find the truth, but actually it looks like the situation is such that I might have to just write all this hack work, and there isn't actually the space for that, but I need to do that because I need to live and make money, right? So the place for like actually independent standards is being squeezed out, right? I think that's the perception of some of the student activists anyway, right? So they are kind of they are protesting against integration, but it's a particular kind of integration, and we might say that, okay, well, that was never going to quite cut it, right? Oh well, you might gain some like autonomy for your particular profession, but we need to transform society as a whole. But I mean, the point is, it could have been potentially a stepping stone, right? Not
right. You start with why can't I be an honest journalist, and you investigate.
Right. I mean, it's you've been a bit fixated on this recently, or at least the problem of journalism. I mean, I think you've talked about it before, and it's something that even comes up in Lukács, right? About the reification of the professions already in the early 20th century. So I don't think this is like, it might be changed, sort of different, but like it's not a completely new problem that they're encountering. But I don't think that's not bad. Like they're coming up against something that has been encountered before in a new way, and that could have gone somewhere. I think that's partly and this is why I was surprisingly sympathetic to the Ehrenreichs. Like, even if I overall disagree with the framing, that they were they weren't being as sort of workerist as I had thought, in the sense of they weren't just valorizing the untainted, like perfectly revolutionary and good working class. I mean, they might steer a bit close to that in places, but they are trying to find what is the role for these people in a revived left. Like, we want them here. We can't do it without these people. These are the intellectuals as well. But at the moment, it just seems like everywhere. And I mean, this is I think this has descriptive validity to it, right? That we see these conflicts within left organizations between and they come across as cultural and stemming from educational differences. So I think the fact that they're trying to deal with that is good. I think the sort of apparatus that they build out of it, the class analysis, is maybe superfluous and maybe not helpful. But sorry, I forgot your initial question.
No, that's great. No, I did too. But no, you actually answered more than my initial question, which is great. So yeah, one thing that comes to mind as you describe how the PMC might be led to question its own position by trying to hold true to various kinds of particular bourgeois values, the value of, let's say, medicine or scientific research, or the value of the kinds of professional values that you have to embrace as an historian or of an academic in general, or the values of a journalist or of an artist. All of these things are turned against themselves and also limited, because nothing is truly autonomous under capitalism, right? The realm of freedom is very narrow, and
right.
And also turns against itself. But what I also recall is in the 90s, there was this notion, and actually it's kind of attached to seem fixated, narcissistically fixated, but the category of Generation X, which originally described the silent generation and then the boomers, also came along with this notion that that this generation included a new creative class. That
Richard Florida, that was his name, the guy who wrote about that.
Yeah, and that because of the alienation that the war had created and the disruption to social life and social norms that were going on in the suburbs, and as America became urban and technological and more technological, the young people were no longer fully being integrated into the culture and were tasked with being the creative class to transform society simply by being young. But that then in the 90s under Clinton kind of got transformed into the creative economy, the information economy, where workers were no longer needed, but what was needed were information jockeys, the laptop class, right? And I knew people, that go into advertising or, various kinds of communication work, and be paid near middle class salaries, comfortable enough salaries for a little while. So there was this notion that, and not only was it thought that we didn't need workers in terms of like a revolutionary struggle, but also in the realm of economy, we no longer had to have profitable industries in order to keep our profits flowing. And, you could just live off rent or financialization. You can make one .com after another. And these things would eventually bear fruit, but they didn't have to actually be productive or make sense. There was like something like pets.com which was worth like nearly $1 billion at one point, and you could order like collars and tags off the internet or something like that. So anyway, that's I hope I'm not going too far afield here, but that's
well, I mean, it's got me. You can finish, Doug. Sorry.
No, that's where all this kind of went. That's how it got integrated into the reproduction of capitalist ideology. But I mean, it's not surprising that it would. But that is how it became integrated into neoliberal ideology, I think.
So, I mean, I guess we might want to talk about the whole question of productive and unproductive labor, or production and reproduction, right? Because that's one of the important categories, and
right,
that's tied to this question of mental and manual labor as well, right? Like the idea that there's this class called the PMC that is in some way primarily reproductive, as opposed to the productive working class, I think is quite problematic, right? And
yeah, because I always thought that you couldn't be generating value if you were actually producing something new. You could only generate value by producing commodities, which were copies of maybe some intellectual property or something. Like, you'd make 1 million Campbell soup cans, but the guy who drew the label didn't produce value. It was only the workers who were reproducing the object every day.
So I think, so it's something that comes up in the debates around the original articles. There's this connection between labor and capital, which I thought I had here, but I don't, which is just the original articles from Radical America, and then a lot of responses. And the people who are, I suppose, trying to be more orthodox, or maybe those who are like slightly more influenced by critical theory or similar, they are doing this kind of Marxological move of saying like, oh, wait a second, like you can't separate production and reproduction in that way. Like every worker reproduces capitalist social relations, which is true, right? I think, or it's true as an interpretation of Marx, right? I think the way this manifests today is like, okay, so you have someone like Malcolm Cheyune, who was he's associated with this Udbro Partit in Sweden, and one of his ideas, I'm not sure if it's his idea or Marcus Allard, but who's his like colleague in that, or was, has this idea of the transferiat, right? Like they are a class or a group or a stratum of people whose jobs are completely dependent on the state for their existence, right? They're basically getting welfare via jobs, right? And I think there's like a kind of weird affinity there with this David Graeber idea of, even though Cheyune is not an anarchist by any stretch of the imagination, there is this affinity with the bullshit jobs idea, right? That there's just this like whole area, this whole sectors of the economy which are just kind of like could just be cut off without it having any effect. And I think we need to be skeptical about that. Like similar things have been said about finance and fictitious capital, especially in neoliberalism, that it's just a sort of way of, there's people skimming stuff off the top. But obviously this is like essential to the reproduction of society. Like before the financial crisis, people were buying houses on those, on those dodgy mortgages, and it did. The crisis came, but I mean, capitalism doesn't reproduce itself in an unproblematic way.
Right.
So the fact that there was later a crisis doesn't mean that it wasn't, essential to its reproduction at that point in time. And I think the same can be said of like, these laptop jobs, PMC jobs, right? They are, I think people fetishize like, they do fetishize like a kind of artisanal labor, maybe, that, well, the only really productive jobs, or the ones that are really essential, are the ones where you or you and your mates are there in the room and you like see the thing get made, and then and then someone buys that and uses it, right? Obviously there's way more complex webs of how we're interconnected, and crazy intangible financial assets and services and stuff that actually do link people up across the world and are important for keeping society going, or turning around. So yeah, I'm skeptical about.
Yeah, I'm with you totally on that on that front. On the other hand, there's this idea of that constantly floated. I think James Burnham was one of the first, maybe not. But the idea that we are post-capitalist always really means we're post labor. We're post value is the way I would put it as a weirdo. So we now no longer, our society is no longer mediated by the time that workers work. But now it's mediated by, fiat currency or advertising campaigns or the education class or what have you, or the these imaginaries or, whatever other force you want to think keeps things in motion other than the reproduction of our material needs, through work and time and the time that it takes to work. So on the one hand, the PMC thesis is not actually making that move, right? In the 70s, it's saying, no, we need to understand the PMC as not the primary class that really sets up the terms for society, but rather as a secondary or intermediary class that assists in the reproduction of the ideology of capital, not necessarily the material conditions of capital, right?
So I think, that's ideology. So, and the example I use in my piece is that, okay, the teacher is part of the PMC because they are explicitly, well, according to the Ehrenreichs, they're explicitly propagating this capitalist ideology. And there's a response from Eric Olin Wright, who's like a kind of analytical Marxist sociologist that agonizes over this in the collection, clearly, well, because he's an academic and he's like trying to be like, that can't be true. That can't be true. We've got to find a way this isn't true. I don't think it's true, but then they would say that also they are like reproducing capitalist social relations because they're preparing people for the workforce, and like this is the kind of Bowles and Gintis like schooling in capitalist America kind of idea, which is obviously true, right? Like that is one of the functions of schooling. But they would also say that someone who is like appears to be completely non-ideological, like really we haven't talked about this yet, and it's quite important. It's like the figure of the engineer or the technician. Actually, the reason it even has to be called the professional managerial class is because these seemingly disparate things are being yoked together. So people who are like more obviously concerned with ideology, like advertising, marketing people, ad men, madmen. Like I keep thinking about Mad Men when I'm thinking about this, but and then you have like the engineers, right, who seem to be playing this like non-ideological role of just ensuring that production runs as smoothly and efficiently as possible. But that what they would say is that that's enforcing capitalist labor discipline, right? So they are in some way objectively antagonistic to like the rest of the working class or the actual working class. So we could maybe think a bit more about that, because I think that's where, for me, that's where it starts like ramifying out, or I start seeing like echoes of debates within the left or within Marxism gone past, right?
What do you see? Like what debate comes to mind from the past that's being reproduced there?
I suppose, I mean, there's a lot of like non like there's a lot of different periods that are kind of simultaneously brought to mind, right? Like, so the whole question of workers' control, right? So it brings up the question of anarchism, of syndicalism as like a early 20th century movement. I suppose council communism or councilism, the cooperative movement. So going back as far as the 19th century, this is all about the question of like, what is the problem at the level of the factory, and is the solution workers' self-management?
I mean, I just don't see how those debates would really come to mind when it comes to critiquing engineers, because whether you're a workers' co-op or run by council, then you would probably want to make the production process both more efficient,
right,
and safer,
right.
And so the engineers would be called upon to do roughly the same things. Also, as long as you're still trying to, produce mass quantities of commodities, you're going to be turning to the same technicians to solve the same kinds of technical problems, maybe in innovative ways. But I don't see how this question of who decides or where the power is within the factory changes the necessity for efficient modes of production, particularly.
Right. I mean, I think I totally get where you're coming from. I think, and I think if you're coming at it from a sort of Leninist perspective, right, that might be the stance you would take. That really, like, okay, this isn't a problem at the level of the factory, right? Okay, workers' control might come in, or something called workers' control, but really that's about a revolutionary situation and dual power.
Right.
In the
it's about what you're going to make and why, rather than how you're going to make what you make, or you may have to have engineers redesign. If you decide, well, we're not going to make electric cars anymore because the people demand rail or something like that, then you'll be calling upon the engineers to build new kinds of machines for production. But
right, I mean, maybe just to go back to your sort of objection to it. I mean, I think that is one of the problematic or unconvincing parts of the whole PMC thesis, right? And it's actually quite central to it, which I think it again is another part of it that has disappeared completely, right? No one cares about the engineers anymore, or like nobody really knows what that even is. Like, what does the engineer in the factory do, right? I'm not sure I know. Like, I guess I know what the factory foreman does, right? And I guess he's also a PMC in this sense. But yeah, okay, so I mean, this is why I put this sentence in there about okay, if we were trying to rebuild a socialist movement, we might want to do something like have more, have a local health clinic that is more patient-centered, although hopefully we wouldn't use that jargon, right? The Socialist Party might serve, not to sound like a crazy Maoist or Black Panther or something, but they might serve the community, serve the people, right? As a kind of part of this movement. I mean, I don't think it would have to take the form that the Ehrenreichs suggest. I think back to like the SPD, right, in Germany, late 19th, early 20th century. Okay, they had socialist lawyers, and they weren't saying, I'm going to turn this case over to you, I will let you defend yourself, right? Because obviously if people were coming to them like, I need your expertise to get me off this charge, right? But what they would do is they'd just do it for free, right? Like as their service to the party, right? So it was a slightly different idea, right? But I mean, I think in general, like, okay, I can see that being part of a revived socialist movement if such a thing were to exist, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, like in some transitional period when the workers have hypothetically taken power, or even after that, that somehow expertise would be dissolved entirely, right? I mean, because there is this idea out there of overcoming the division of labor. I mean, what does that mean? Does that mean that there would be no more like specialists? I mean, I don't think so. I think maybe Spencer Leonard has mentioned before this phrase from Durkheim, the division of labor and society, where Durkheim was a socialist of a sort and had sort of maybe syndicalist sympathies, but he talked about the emancipation of the professional organizations, which, you know, maybe would make people cringe or something, but I can see how, you know, if you're freeing society and like freeing what we would now call civil society, but I mean, maybe that makes no sense if it's not contrasted with the state, but, you know, there would be a place for voluntary organizations, surely, and those voluntary organizations would probably want to set standards about certain practices, and, you know, especially if they were trying to serve other people. So I don't think the horizon should be somehow like destroying expertise or destroying technical knowledge, right? I think where do they get the idea that this is bad from? I guess they are influenced by Maoism, even though. Today, in preparation for this, I read this piece from 2013, which is them kind of revisiting the PMC thesis called "Death of the Yuppie Dream," in which they say post-Occupy, actually the PMC is dead. So like it kind of solved itself. Like the history just took care of them, which is interesting because people sort of forget about that part of it. But so they say in that they're like, oh yeah, well obviously the revolution in China turned out horribly, but in the 70s they were less sure about that. I think they had some hopes in the Cultural Revolution, and I think what they saw in that was a kind of bottom-up revolt of, you know, the manual workers and the peasants against the technical technicians and intelligentsia, which was a kind of way of overcoming the problems with Stalinism, right? So it was the sort of Maoist opposition to Stalinism in the USSR. You know, because I think by then it was a fairly established interpretation of the USSR that there was this new bureaucracy which was, you know, partly constituted of the kind of, the managers and the technicians, you know, not just managers at the sort of factory level, but like economy wide. So if you were excited by the Cultural Revolution, maybe you could see that, like, okay, they've identified this problem in like transition to socialism, so, you know, they're taking this step to make sure that doesn't happen. So I think there's also a retrospective reading of like Leninism as well, as not having confronted that problem, like the problem of Taylor. You know, it accepted Taylorism, it accepted bourgeois specialists, it accepted you know, the technical division of labor between like the engineer and the rest of the factory. So I think they probably saw in Stalinism like the outcome, like an inevitable outcome of that, right? So Maoism was a kind of maybe an opportunity or like a model that could avoid that. But again, like, they're aware that they're in the US and it's not going to be like China, right? But they're taking inspiration from it anyway.
Well, I recall, maybe not quite a decade ago, but maybe 8 years ago, or no, six years ago, something like that. I was talking to Michael Brooks. You know who Michael Brooks was?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And somehow or another, I ended up in the position of saying that when we accomplished socialism, that life would be much more like everyday life for most people would be similar to the life of a college professor.
Horrible. That's it. I give up.
No, I know, but this is, and he said he had that reaction, right? And I was like, no, I'm not a college professor, so, and it's been a long time since I've been in college, so I still idealize the academic life in some way. But the point is that you would be pursuing productive activity on the basis of your own intellect and in cooperation with others in a creative way, where the highest standard would be understanding and the truth and creativity, rather than being subordinated to the drive to produce a profit or reproduce labor, or you would actually be free to develop, and you would be in relationships with others where you would be competing maybe to be the smartest one, or maybe you'd have little cliques or whatever around your ideas, but it without the threat of violence.
It's very Rousseauian of you, Doug. Right? That, like, he sees in that friendly competitiveness and the pride, like that's actually a good force within society. And like maybe we will unleash that, right? Like maybe
that's what
poetry competitions.
Right.
Like in
that's
Greece.
That's what the technicians are fundamentally. All these, or the professional managers, whatever, they're the intellectuals. So the people who are trying to think and put their ideas into practice, into their lives. They're the ones that are supposedly given that task, and yet they're constrained in this variety of ways. And so the division of labor isn't about overcoming the technicians, overcoming that technocratic class isn't about defeating the intellectuals and turning to the uneducated to run the world, but rather educating everyone.
I guess with this whole,
I'm sorry, I'm not sticking to the topic here, but
no. I mean, the first thing that came to mind when you said everyone be like a college professor, I was thinking, I think it's Trotsky who says, like, everyone can be a Goethe or Einstein, right? So you should set your sights higher, right?
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. No offense. I mean, so some of the best people I know are college professors, but
Well, I know
they would want to take up that role in a future society if they could.
like I said, I have a romanticized, Dead Poets Society version of the teacher. Not the terrible bureaucratic, soulless, lifeless dreck that is actually the college professor today. But yeah, anyway, that's just my objection again to the workerism and the Maoism, I suppose. But the point is, I think what's most interesting about your essay, and what's most interesting to me about this conversation, is that the category of the PMC is not simply a slur. It's not the political formation that needs to be defeated, but rather it just sort of is a product of the contradictions of our society and the problems that emerge from trying to overcome it. It's one of the ways that the left has failed, is by going into a cul-de-sac around this question without clarifying it adequately. Would that be a fair way to say it?
So I think what's actually good about the article, and maybe this would be a good place to end this part, is that, well, they do actually have some kind of historical account of how this supposed class came into being, and it's all about progressivism, right? Like in the capital P sense. I mean, they see it as continuing all the way down to like the second half of the 20th century. but like progressivism plays a role in this, as does like the development of what we might call monopoly capitalism. Right, that's another thing that makes the kind of degradation of labor and then the de-skilling, which leaves room for then PMC professionals to come in and, you know, take over functions that maybe were previously carried out by the working class themselves. So that they do have an account of this, and there is a critique of progressivism and like the welfare state in there, right? Which I think gets completely evacuated when people invoke this concept today, right? Actually, they'll say the PMC is the people who are stopping us from getting universal healthcare, right? Whereas the Ehrenreichs were saying, you know, it's the doctors, who at this point in the 70s, they are the PMC, right? They are, and the social workers, you know, it's this. So I was reading Adorno's Reflections on Class Theory for the Platypus Reading Group, and he has this, you know, I think Chris maybe has mentioned this before, but there's this controversial line in there where he's saying, at this point in history, right, maybe the wife of the worker who comes home drunk and beats her has more to fear from the social worker than from her husband. And I mean, maybe that, you know, can sound horrific. It sounds it's unintelligible. It's like, why would he ever say this? Because the welfare state is our horizon. That's what we want, isn't it? You know, especially in the UK. That's our religion and our God, the NHS and the welfare state. So I think that is something to try and retain from the article, right? I mean, I think too often people just pull out like PMC to use as an epithet, and evacuate that whole historical context. You know,
I want to say one thing in response to that and give you a chance to respond, and then we'll end this half. But it is worth remembering that the reasons given for supporting Medicare for all in the United States were primarily about creating conditions that were less precarious for working class people so that they could develop their abilities and develop their skills to be more self-sufficient and to be more political, and to stand up against the bosses more effectively, and to have higher union participation rates and so forth and so on. But it was thought to be a necessary step to intervene with the state to create more secure conditions for workers, so they would be able to turn against the de-skilling and the dehumanization that they were experiencing and be less competitive. It was so ultimately, even those who would say, oh, the horizon in the short-term horizon is universal health care, are thinking that the workers need to be liberated and more self-sufficient and put in charge. At least that's what they were saying.
Maybe I think some of them were saying that.
That's what
I think people maybe forgot that quite quickly. But
the Jacobin set were saying that.
Yeah,
kind of thing,
sure.
you know?
I mean, I meant to say that earlier when you were sort of putting them, straightforwardly saying like Jacobin equals Sanders campaign, right? Like there was obviously more to that, and I guess there still is to a degree. Like that they aren't completely identical with the sort of I don't know, neo-social democracy. If that's, I'm not sure that's even a good term, but okay, Bernie and Corbyn phenomenon, right? Yeah, I guess the question is like, how do you think? Do you think that would work, right? I mean, I think
No, I don't think that's a good strategy. But that's a justification. But that I don't think
is increased union density going to increase like the self-sufficiency of the working class. Probably
not.
The way that
No.
people imagine.
Look, what I remember, and I discovered this recently, but I remember in the 90s that healthcare for all was just a constant campaign in the background of all left politics. That there was a certain layer of people like increase the minimum wage, healthcare for all. Those were the big campaigns that would come and go like clockwork. And just the other day, I watched yesterday, I just watched an old McGovern ad where he was out there advocating for healthcare for all. And what was it, 72? So, it's not as though this approach is new, and it's fairly clear that McGovern did not end up radicalizing the Democratic Party, that the McGovernism became Clintonism, so.
Right. I mean, also, we've had an NHS here for quite some time now. Mm-hmm. it may be falling apart. It may be about to be transformed. It has been transformed in certain ways over the last, 30, 40 years. But I don't know if it's translated into a more vibrant socialist movement.
I'm going to say no.
I think it's actually been, in some ways, it's been a huge obstacle to that. I mean, ideologically as well. Mm-hmm. I maybe I'm gonna get beheaded now. But I think maybe that's too simplistic, and I'm sure I know the healthcare situation in the US is bad, and I probably would also want some amelioration of that if I was living in the US, but I that doesn't mean we have to pretend it's the strategic.
You know what I love about today? ChatGPT. I just asked ChatGPT what's the longevity in the UK today, and it says you expect to be about 78 years old when you die in the UK, and nice. In the US, there are exceptions, by the way, and Aubrey de Grey is coming to the rescue. But and 78 years old is approximately the life expectancy for a male in the U.S. So yeah.
Okay. I thought you were going to say it was lower, but no. See, they're banning our vapes. They're stopping us smoking. We're already old enough. Like 78.
Wait. I thought the UK was big into vaping because they wanted people to quit smoking.
They just banned disposable flavored vapes. Yeah. It was like the last day, a few days ago. I mean, they've already got around. Okay, we should not.
Let's wrap this up, and we'll talk about vaping in the other half. All right. I'm going to end the recording there. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.